My name is Mary Bergman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. This is the second day of our Rescuing History Conference about historic preservation and issues of sustainability as they relate to climate change. And this is our third such conference on this topic. We're so thrilled for the support of the Community Foundation for Maine Nantucket Fund that has sponsored this event and all of our symposium events, and for the support of all of our leadership supporters. And you can find more about that on our website, nantucketpreservation.org. We're a small nonprofit membership-based historic preservation advocacy organization here on Nantucket, 30 miles out to sea. Nantucket is a national historic landmark and a local historic district. Yesterday, we talked a lot about building waste and demolition waste, and there are different ways, different things that could happen when a building reaches the end of its life cycle if it was not a preferably preserved building. And today we're looking at ways to adapt structures. And then in the afternoon, we'll be talking more about solar power and how to integrate solar into local historic districts and other historic settings. Everything is being recorded yesterday and today. So if you have to leave, go about your other work, go outside and enjoy this beautiful day, you'll be getting an email with all the links to the presentations. Sometime in the next 2 weeks, we'll get those done and out to you. And then please share them with your friends, with your colleagues, with anybody you think would find this information interesting. We'd be really, I want to get these conversations going on and off island. So our first presentation today, really excited to introduce you to Ben Haavik. Ben is the Historic New England's team leader for property care. He's responsible for the preservation and maintenance of all of the 38 properties open to the public. If anybody's been to has a particular favorite historic New England property, put that in the chat. Would love to know. He oversees 15 full-time staff, which includes preservation carpenters, preservation managers, and landscape staff. He's got a master's degree in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania and is a professional associate of the American Institute of Conservation. He started his career working for the Fairmont Park Historic Preservation Trust and then the Historic House Trust of New York City. And during his 17 years at Historic New England, Ben introduced a system for strategic prioritization and management of historic New England's properties, spearheaded system-wide initiatives to understand their systems starting, developed a weatherization and energy efficiency framework, established best practices for house museum security, developed a framework for resiliency in the face of climate change, and is currently spearheading the effort to make historic New England sites accessible. So please join me in welcoming Ben.
Thank you, Mary, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me to share what we've been working on. And with that, I'm going to bring up my presentation. And so Mary had asked me to talk about some of our initiatives. And so I'm going to focus on three different aspects of climate change and the resiliency work we're doing. And I'll say that we are very, very focused on rain events. Rain is, as we all know, I think July and August have been the rainiest in a long time, as 17 inches have fallen. We had an additional like 6 inches in the last week. It's a lot of rain. And when you're dealing with a collection of historic properties, you think about rain all the time. And that's not to downplay, of course, sea level rise, which I know Nantucket is very focused on. But I spend a lot of time thinking about rain and how water is coming down from the sky and affecting our properties. As Mary mentioned, we do have a framework for resiliency and climate change. There's lots of items here on the list, but we're not going to look at those. We're going to really focus on three different initiatives that we've been working on at Historic New England: gutters, site drainage, and energy efficiency. And so with that, I am going to take a step back and say thank you for that wonderful introduction. Historic New England is a regional preservation organization. We do many different things, but one of our most public aspects is the 38 historic sites, which range from Rhode Island up to mid-coast Maine, 17th century to 20th century houses. There's over 165 buildings and over 1,300 acres of landscape. And as you heard, I'm responsible for the preservation and maintenance of those properties. So everything from brush clearing to garden restoration, from heating system maintenance and gutter cleaning to roof replacement. All of it is in the effort to keep our properties looking the way they did at a specific time. So my job is also very focused on house museums and presenting a period in time. So it's a little different than a house in a historic district, which may have certain restrictions on it. We actually take it to the next level because we're really trying to preserve things to a very specific time. And that sometimes is limiting in how we can approach things. But I think climate change is shaking things up a little bit and forcing us to rethink some of our approaches. So let's start with gutters. And I think we have to start in 2018 when we received a grant from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission through the National Park Service to analyze the carrying capacity of our gutters in that state. And so we started with 3 core questions. And I'm going to give you the answers that I thought we were going to walk away with from this study. Are our gutters good enough for today's rainstorms? Of course they are. They seem totally fine. Will they be sufficient for future more intense rainstorms? Probably not, right? That's the whole thing about climate change. Things are just going to get worse. So probably the gutters won't hold up long term. And then what are the failure points? We were kind of perceiving some repairs of bad workmanship being the core issues that might be stopping up some of our gutters and kind of preventing the flow of water. So this was our hypothesis going into this study. And why gutters? Well, of course, it's the major defense, part of the major defense system for your building. So you've got the roof keeping the water out, but then the water runs off the roof into what? Well, either the ground or a gutter system. So that's keeping the water off the side of your building. It's keeping it from the foundation of your building. And if you let that, and if the gutter system fails, then the water starts to deteriorate the paint. It starts to get into the wood. It starts to work its way into the building in many different ways. And we've seen a lot of them at Historic New England. So this gutter study, we had 9 sites in Maine that we were looking at, 7 of our house museums, and then Historic New England also has an easement program with 116 easements, so private homes with preservation restrictions that we hold and monitor. And so 2 of those easement properties were included in the study. So 9 different sites throughout Maine, and we were looking at 21 different roof drainage systems. So it was like 21 different instances where a roof and a gutter kind of met up. And what we were doing was we were calculating for capacity, and there's some standard formulas that you use. If you Google this, on the internet, you'll find there's some, key factors like the area of the roof, the slope of the roof, the intensity of the rain, and then the dimensions of your gutter component. If you're designing from scratch, you do the first 3 and figure out what the dimensions should be. We had to do a little reverse math to figure out that's what it should be, but this is what we have, and how does it all match up? So there was a lot of math, a lot of charts, a lot of cross-referencing. But let's just remember the rain intensity. So we're looking this up online, and most of the online resources that are telling you how to calculate rain intensity are all pointing to basically the same data charts. And that's really important because the data charts for 1977. And so gutter calculations, if you just did it yourself, you would probably be led to make a calculation based on 1977 rain. We found the National Weather Service has more up-to-date rain intensity numbers, and there's this kind of complicated 10-year rolling average that they use to figure out what a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year storm would be. And so we went to the National Weather Service and we pulled more up to date, like 2015 numbers for rain intensity, and the shifted, it was a 25% shift. That is major. That is a major change in intensity from 1977, and that really does affect how you design your gutters. And so that was like our important, really important data point in this project. So what did we find? We looked at all of these gutters, we did the math, we crunched the numbers. And when we're looking at, so there's three components to a gutter system that we were really looking at. So the gutter is obviously the horizontal piece that's kind of at the end of your roof, the eaves of the roof. And what we found was 50% of the time, the gutters failed the calculation. They were not big enough. They didn't have the carrying capacity for the roof that they were trying to empty of water. Now there's a lot of variables there, a lot of different types of gutters that we looked at. We looked at kind of modern gutters, we looked at wooden gutters, we looked at half round metal gutters. There's a lot of different variables, a lot of different size roofs. But still, in the end, there was a high failure rate for gutters. Downspouts, so the pipe carrying the water down the building, effectively at that point, the downspouts were not a problem. Like once you got the water running down like that, that wasn't really where our problem was. Our problem was really in this outlet. And so the outlet is this pipe that connects the gutter to the downspout. And what you find over and over again on historic houses is this tiny, tiny piece of metal, this little pipe. And that was a core issue. 50% of our outlets failed, and there was a lot less variability on this. This was like either it was under 2 inches and it failed every time. So the diameter of the outlet was under 2 inches, or if it was over, it had a much greater success rate. And so this is some like key data that we pulled from this choke point. And if you can imagine it, you have all this water rushing down your gutter, like in this image, and then there's a tiny hole. So where's the water supposed to go? And what we always perceived as maybe a clogged gutter was in fact water not able to drain fast enough down the tiny hole and overflowing the sides. So we always said, oh, the gutter needs to be clean. But then you go up there and be like, oh, it's kind of fine. I wonder why it's all the water's kind of spilling out like that. Well, it's because the hole is too small. And again, here's a wooden gutter with a less than 2 inch hole. And then just to illustrate, here's the outlet, why the downspouts not really an issue. It's a really small downspout, but look how small the outlet is. So the downspout is going to carry the water fine once it gets there. It's really, can you get the water to the downspout? So if we go back to the initial 3 questions that we posed, are our gutters good enough for today's rainstorms? Well, no, actually, they were not. We had lots of issues, and we discovered that there were issues. So will they be sufficient for future more intense rainstorms? No, if they're not working today, what makes us think that in 20, 30, 40 years, they're going to be working better? They're not. The rain's just going to keep getting more and more intense if we think of the predictions are true. And they're not working. So what are the failure points? It's not the repairs. The repairs are almost irrelevant. It was the actual gutters and the actual outlets. And so this is critical, right? This is like this major point of defense for your building. So what we're thinking about is, first of all, you got to pay attention to your gutter. It's kind of easy sometimes to ignore it. Mine at home gets clogged all the time, and it's like, and I've got to go up and clean it. But you want to kind of ignore it because it's just this chore. But you got to pay attention. This is really important to keep the water moving. As I mentioned, if you're going to calculate, and if you're going to let someone else calculate the size that your gutter should be, you use the current rain data. Make sure you really understand what is going on. Now, Maine was 25%. I'll tell you, we did the same exercise in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island's change over 1977 to 2015 wasn't as significant. So it's gonna be different, region by region, town by town. but you should look at that data, because that data is really important, and you should make sure it's as up to date as possible, because you want to think about sizing when planning a project. Now, this isn't just a new roof, a new building and a new gutter. It's your existing gutter. So if your gutter is starting to fail, or it's not working, or you're doing the roof and they're like, hey, we should replace the gutter at the same time, think about how big it is. Think about whether it's carrying the water. Think about whether you've seen water spill over the sides. Maybe do the calcs, or ask someone to do the calcs for you to figure out what's going on. And maybe the preservation issue, maybe in-kind replacement is no longer feasible. And this is kind of that key point for historic districts, where it's like, can I change the gutter, because the gutter's not carrying water and the gutter's protecting the building, and is it the most important character defining feature or not? And this is that kind of debate of also alternative materials. If you look at that top picture, what I have is I believe it's a 5-inch wooden gutter, and inside of a 5-inch aluminum gutter. Now look at the difference in carrying capacity of the two. The wooden gutter has this tiny trough carved out of it. That can't hold very much. So it's 5 inches, but it's not 5 inches of pure capacity. It's probably like 3 inches across, and maybe 2 inches deep. That's much different than what you're looking at in the aluminum gutter. So maybe if you have real issues, you can keep the profile, but change the materials. We also are faced with situations where sometimes we just like, the process of replacing a gutter is tremendous, but maybe we just change the outlet size. And so the bottom picture is where we took a 1.5-inch diameter hole. We expanded it to 2.5 inches. Because we were like, I can't change the gutter right now. It's too complicated. It's too much of it. It actually is in this house, it is a character defining feature. And we're not really at a stage where I could consider replicating it in a copper or aluminum or something else and having that conversation, but I can increase the capacity of that outlet. And so it's not all or nothing. Like we can do like baby steps also. And we've been seeing great success where we've just increased the outlet size. So it doesn't, they're calculations, that it's math, and it's giving you a pretty strong sense of what's going on. But if you need to, you can just do part of it. And that's kind of what we're doing with gutters. But I've just explained the fact that we're calculating all of this runoff from the gutter down the downspout, but where does it go from there? And so that's kind of our next issue is where does the water go? And then you can see in this picture, it's actually this house, it's Hamilton House. It's up in South Berwick, Maine. It's got beautiful 5-inch half round copper gutters, huge carrying capacity. It takes the water away from the building. But 40 years ago, they said, we're going to outlet the water here in the middle of this terrace. And actually, this was never an issue. But now that we're getting more and more intense rainstorms, we're seeing dramatic erosion at the outlet spot. And so you really have to think about where the water goes once you get it off your roof. And so that's our next point, which is site drainage. And we're spending a lot of time really focused on how water moves around our sites. And a lot of this came in part in kind of 2010. There was some huge rainstorms that struck the area, and everything was overwhelmed, and we got flooding, everywhere. And it made us really think about site drainage. And this was long before we were actually even thinking about climate change, but we were saying, hey, we've got an issue with water on our sites, and what are we going to do about it? And so we really kind of wanted a holistic approach, because I could fix one thing, but it may cause another problem somewhere else. And maybe we should look at the whole picture. So we did holistic site drainage assessments, where we were like, how is the water moving at all of these different sites? What are the components, and what is working and not working? And ultimately, how does that all play together in a big project to solve all the site issues with drainage. Because again, it's like a ripple effect. If you change one thing, it probably will ripple over to another area. A colleague of mine just showed me where this is a gutter example, but they upsized one gutter to handle the rain because they were seeing water fall down, but they weren't really paying attention to the fact that all of that water was kind of outletting onto a secondary roof, which still had a very small gutter. And so they now resolved one issue and caused, the ripple effect. Now they're causing an issue in a second place where the water overflows that hits the ground, gets into the foundation. So again, holistic thinking is really important especially when you're thinking about water and how it moves around your site. Now, we have the added issues as a house museum organization. We have archaeological artifacts, and we're very careful about those. And so we'll work with an engineer, we'll design a plan, but then we bring in the archaeologists and we figure out what's going on under the ground, where maybe the engineer wants to do stuff. Then we tell the engineer, like, these are deal breakers, you have to change your plan. The engineer gets mad, but we're a preservation organization, so we're trying to protect the resources both above ground and underground. But eventually we come out with a plan. Now, the other wrinkle is that I want to do this work with a minimum of change to the historic landscape. So we also want to respect how the grounds look before, and we want to keep it as similar. It's very difficult when you're working with drainage, and frankly, some of the drainage issues are because 200 years have passed and the ground has changed and things have evolved. But we have been very successful with these projects in that we have we weren't thinking about climate change, we were just thinking about moving water properly. And at the 5 of our sites where we did holistic massive site drainage projects, in the recent storms, we've been having 0 problems. No water in the basements, no pooling in weird locations, all the water's moving where we want it to move. And so it's been very successful. So again, our points about site drainage are really about, thinking holistically. We favor gravity. You can use pumps and you can do all sorts of things, but those will fail. If you have a power outage, the pump's not going to work anymore. And so then the water's not really moving away. So you always want to try to think of, water moves down and can you keep doing that? But also, it's important to think about the aesthetics of your site. But in all of that, and all of the catch basins and dry wells and different site drainage things we've added, we still haven't really solved the where does the water go, because it's still got to go somewhere. And most sites and most towns will tell you have to keep it on your own site. And so how do you do that? And sometimes we're blessed with large acreage, and obviously in urban environment, we have houses in urban environments where we don't have a lot of space, and we have to tackle this in all of those, because even if you have a dry well, there needs to be a release valve for when that maybe gets stressed by storms. So then that's releasing water. Where is that water going? It's like a never-ending series of questions. And really, in the early days, we were focused on what's called a level spreader. And this is a horrible image, and I couldn't find a good image of this, but basically we have all of this kind of water being channeled, and it's got to come out somewhere. We've got to just let the water go. And so at this site, what it is all the water kind of gets merged underground into a location where we can then outlet it with basically 100-foot gravel trench that allows the water to kind of push out over the gravel trench, not cause erosion, and then filter back down into the groundwater in that way. And that's effective, but if for me, in terms of historic landscapes and aesthetics, we can usually hide this, but it's not my favorite approach, which is fascinating because now we're in the age of really thinking these things through. And so I present rain gardens. We only have 1 or 2 at our properties, but the rain garden is also an alternative for stormwater management. One that's very effective in many locations, in many urban environments, where you're taking the water and you're basically creating kind of, it's a bioretention area where you're allowing these kind of swampy water plants, so all natives, all kind of good for the environment, to take that water, help absorb it, but also help filter out the bad stuff in the water, while then the water sinks back down into your groundwater. And so this accomplishes many different things. It provides that kind of pollution filter. It provides the groundwater that the level spreader does, but it also provides this interesting habitat opportunity with native plants. And what are you doing there? And so for me, that gives some opportunity to rethink how we present some of our landscapes, and even reintroducing more native plants in a specific way to help mitigate stormwater management. That's also aesthetic and also good for the environment. So this is kind of the area we're exploring. So I didn't really talk about climate change with our site drainage, and in part that's because it's been very effective so far, and we haven't had to change very much of our thought approach. But we are deep in planning 3 different kind of site drainage projects with 2 different engineers, and we've been kind of discussing this topic with them. So, my experience with the gutters tells me we need to upsize everything. My experience with the civil engineers is that, unlike the roof kind of planning, which maybe is a little bit more contractor based, maybe an architect does it, maybe maybe the homeowner does it like us, there's a little wiggle room. I'm not qualified to do site drainage engineering, and neither is a contractor, and so we hire an engineer, and the engineers are thinking about this stuff, and so they're also using the data that we need. They're using modern data, like the code tells them to go get the current data on the National Weather Service. So they are thinking about this. That being said, we've had many conversations where we just say, they're like, oh, all you need is a 3-inch pipe, and we say, okay, that's great. I was like, how much is it going to cost just to upsize that to 4 inches or 5 inches? It's underground, no one's going to know, we're excavating now. Can we make this bulletproof for 100 years, and the upcharge with kind of going up in size like that isn't that significant when you're dealing with a major project. And so we've been making those modifications. Now it takes you as the homeowner or the landowner to be aggressive enough to ask those questions and to push a little bit if they push back. But you can usually get your answer in there, and that's what we're trying to do. Is these systems are working and they are good, but are we really prepped for longer term stability and resilience at the sites? And so sometimes that might just be changing the pipe size a little bit. And so definitely something we're talking about and deeply immersed in. Now, my final point is one that's a little more proactive about, our role in causing climate change, and that's, energy use and efficiency. And I just throw up this chart, which has, I said 38 sites. I think that translates into something like 65 different heating plants, electric meters, that kind of thing. It's not every single one of our 165 buildings has a heating system, and our heating systems are all kind of variable because we're working with museums. So some of them are maybe a little bit more geared towards humidity control rather than human comfort. And we don't have that many air conditioning systems, so we're kind of balancing a lot of different things than a homeowner would balance, but we're still using a lot of energy. So about 10 years ago, we started really thinking about this. Now, I will fully admit 10 years ago, it was all about money. It was about saving money. It wasn't about saving the environment. It was about saving money. Can we make the systems more efficient so that we're spending less on utilities? That feeling obviously has changed these days, because we've realized that there's a whole nother role we can play with these 38 sites, but the framework we developed is still quite effective. And so our approach to energy efficiency is really about baseline measurement and metrics, air leakage and stopping what air leakage we can, insulation, HVAC and utility improvements, and then thinking about behaviors and traditional techniques. And that may need to go first, possibly, or maybe if before you do the improvements, we should talk about behaviors and traditional techniques. But ultimately, this is kind of the program that we're looking at. And I'll highlight throughout this two different examples. We did the Lyman Mansion, 1793 Lyman Mansion in Waltham, Massachusetts, where the goal was to reduce energy usage 50%. We didn't have quite the same goal at the Pierce House, but this was more of a residential style house, though it has quirks because it's a museum and education site that a homeowner wouldn't have. But this was to take that more kind of urban residential house and see what changes we could make. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on baseline measurements and metrics. You can get a home audit. You can gather your utility data yourself. We do a lot of this ourselves, gather the data. But then ultimately, at some point, you need some other measurements besides energy usage, and like the blower door that's shown here, where basically you see if you can depressurize your house, and the ability to depressurize it will tell you how much air leakage you have. And of course, air leakage is kind of symbolic of wasted energy, because if your house is leaky, you're either letting in a lot of cold air or you're letting out hot air. You're not being efficient in your use. So to speak about air leakage, again, for this project, we were able to buy ourselves some toys. We bought ourselves the blower door and an infrared camera, so that we could really kind of dig into the data and understand. But in here, this is just kind of evocative of the air leakage issue, where the blower door is going. We're looking, so we're kind of depressurizing the house, which means you're kind of sucking in the outdoor air. And so you can really see from the purple at the bottom of this door in the infrared image that cold air is just being, it's just moving its way into the house. And that's what you want to try to prevent. And so with a lot of air leakage, we as a preservation and a museum organization kind of favor simple solutions. And so maybe we will add a little door sweep, or in this case, we had a door that was like the fourth means of egress from the house, so it wasn't needed for safety issues. So we put just a piece of half round molding there just to stop the airflow, just little things to keep the air in the building. Likewise, on the exterior, we're looking at, foundation is letting a lot of air in and out. Well, let's repoint the foundation and use good preservation practices to seal it up. Oh, look, air's coming in and out of the house. Look at that hole by the gutter. We're going to fix that. And all of a sudden, you're improving your efficiency with every repair you make. Likewise, what is a good air barrier? Historic plaster. And so we looked at a couple locations where we had let plaster not be repaired because maybe it was in the basement or somewhere else, and we said, okay, so we're going to repair the plaster and get a better air seal in between, say, the basement and the upper floor, or one of the floors in the attic. What we don't like is spray foam. I think we're one of many that don't like it. For us, again, similar to energy usage, this started as more of a purely preservation of focus thing, where the use of spray foam is hard to remove. It theoretically not permanent, but it's kind of permanent, and it's kind of just, it's awful stuff. And now we find out it's also awful for the environment. I'm not an expert on that, but I did a quick Google search last year and was like, oh, this doesn't look like good stuff to use. But what we had done is we have giant gaps, like the kind of right-hand top picture has giant gaps in the Pierce house. And what do? How do you fill that? Well, we kind of fell back on Tyvek pillows, where we took Tyvek and we stuffed them with insulation and then stuffed them in the gaps. And we basically stopped the airflow through these gaps with doing something that we can just grab it and pull it out if we want to. So reversible in a preservation focus. Of course, we don't favor replacement of windows. Again, there's the durability and quality of a historic window far exceeds a replacement window, and I guess they're still making arguments about energy efficiency, but there's ways around that. So we still favor the repair. Now I'm a museum, so again, that is my go-to, is I have to repair these things. But think about the waste. If I was doing the Lyman estate, which had 120 window openings, and we fixed every single one of those as part of this project. Imagine if we replaced every single one of those windows in an effort to make the house more efficient. The landfill from just this project alone would be tremendous. And then think about the lifespan of the new materials versus these 150-year-old windows, because we knew they had been replaced partway through their life, but there are 100, 150 when we touch them, and they will last definitely another 150. So again, that kind of lifespan, that green aspect of historic preservation. But while we were doing that, we made sure all the locks would work so we could get a good tight seal, and we did put spring bronze weather stripping on the sides of the windows to keep things tight. So we wanted to kind of seal the windows as much as possible, not let extra air leak through. To achieve a greater kind of insulation and efficiency, we use storm windows. And so in this case, we actually use 3 different types of storm windows, because Lyman Estate served as a little study for us where we could play with exterior wooden storms, exterior aluminum storms, and then interior storms throughout the house. And as I said, we had a blower door, and we were able to kind of close off one room and do testing before, during, after, at different times. And so we did that in a couple different rooms, and ultimately the kind of merged data said that when we conserved a window and did the little kind of fixes to it, we've reduced kind of the air leakage 5 to 10%. It is a little bit of variable, and there's a lot of other variables in it. When we added a storm window to that, we've reduced air leakage another 10 to 20%. Now there is the interior storm worked a lot better than an exterior storm, but in fact, that's because usually on the exterior, you have weep holes to make sure water is venting out from that side of things. So you actually have some natural air flowing into the storm window. So it's going to be a little less efficient. But our total reduction in air leakage just from windows alone was 15 to 30%. So that was awesome, and that was a great kind of metric for us to have. Because the next phase we were thinking about was insulation. And so I show you a infrared image of a building without insulation. And you can see the roof. The roof is hot. The windows are hot, but not much of the wall is kind of letting go heat, or it's not letting go heat in the same way. And while I think the current data suggests 35% of your heat loss is through the walls, we decided that's not where we were going to focus. We were going to focus on roofs and doing these storm windows and fixing the windows as our focus. And why not the walls? So I spoke to several building scientists, and we talked about some of our buildings specifically, and their response was, we could insulate the walls, but we don't really know what the dynamics are really going to be inside your walls. We don't know how moisture is going to move from the in to the out and out to the in. And if we were building a new house, we would be able to control that. But in an existing house, we can't really control that unless we strip the house down to its studs. And so looking at this problem, they said you could do it and it might be fine. So like if you have insulation in walls, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a problem, but they also said we can't guarantee. So I've had this image up for a while. I don't know if you've noticed that there's discoloration on the building. And the discoloration is in a pattern because this house had blown in insulation added to the house. So the walls are insulated, and now we have patterns of mildew staining on the exterior. And why is that? Because the mildew So I just highlighted the structural framing of this house, which you can see perfectly with the mildew staining. So you know exactly where the studs are in this house and where the insulation is, because the insulation is capturing the moisture, getting wet, not really drying, and then creating kind of that moisture issue transmitting through the walls. So again, does that mean it happens with every house with insulation in the walls? No. But this was the danger, and this is why we chose not to insulate our walls. But we do cap our buildings as best we can. And in the Lyman estate, it was very complicated. And by capping, we're trying to create that barrier between the heated space and the non-heated kind of attic or upper space. And so looking at the Lyman estate, it was complicated, but we figured we actually had a way to create this barrier between conditioned and unconditioned spaces. And we had the opportunity to insulate these spaces. It was complicated and it was tricky, but what a great test study. So we did use dense packed cellulose, blown in cellulose in a lot of the spaces because it was flexible and we could kind of get it where we needed to go a lot easier than kind of insulation bats. But you still have a ton of places with gaps where the insulation company wants to just fill with spray foam. And we had to come up with alternatives. And here's a giant gap next to the chimney stack. And so what we did is we built barriers out of, insulated board. And actually you can see in the corners, we shoved insulation into the gaps in between, the joists to fill the gaps. All of this is to create so that when they blow in the insulation, it doesn't all just spill down the sides of the wall where we don't want it. We keep it controlled. Likewise, the floor framing was very supportive of this effort because the joists in most places were perpendicular to the floorboards. So we were able to pull one floorboard and then blow in every joist bay insulation and get, maximum spread of insulation. The Pierce house was not as readily acceptable of insulation. So this is the attic. It is actually part of the museum experience at the tour. There is a furnished room upstairs. There is this kind of hobby station, which had a radio on it, and we keep it kind of intact as much as we can. Likewise, the building was built in 3 different, segments. And so the joists are just going all over the place. So you can't really just pull up one floorboard like we did at Lyman and blow in insulation. It was all over the place. But ultimately, in discussion with our building scientists, we were very focused on the fact that just some air sealing, like putting weather stripping on the door up to the attic, making sure the gaps were filled again, but also this concept that plaster is a great air barrier, and making sure the plaster ceiling in between the second floor and the attic was intact would give us not insulation, but an air barrier to make sure we're not at least letting hot air leak up constantly into the attic space. And so very helpful situation. HVAC and utilities, if you have them, you probably should update them because there's nothing worse than an old inefficient system. And that's what we had at Lyman. And so ultimately we replaced a very old oil burning system with a natural gas system, updated all the equipment with top of the line efficient models. We redid all the ductwork. Here is showing the old ductwork with massive heat loss, even with the insulation on, to the newer version. Yes, there's a little bit of a heat loss in this, but it's a much tighter production. Of course, our biggest gains probably were the fact that in the ballroom, this duct, what we're looking at is the floor, and then the duct that's supposed to be servicing the ballroom wasn't really connected. And in fact, there was like a 2-inch gap in between the duct and actually the bottom of the floor, which meant that not all the air was getting up into the ballroom. It was just going into the basement space below. And so we got that fixed, and that ductwork wasn't really insulated either. So what did we get from all of this? And at Lyman Mansion, we got 47 reduction in energy usage. And Lyman is a monster of a house, and it's very complicated, and its use is complicated because it's used for functions and all sorts of stuff. So not like just a homeowner, but yet we still squeezed 47% reduction in energy usage out of it just through those measures we talked about. At Pierce House, we reduced air leakage by 30% in the house. And it was complicated. It's a complicated house and how it's used, but we also reduced the energy bills by 17%. Not quite as aggressive as Lyman, but we also didn't change the heating plant there, or we didn't do other things involved. So it wasn't quite as aggressive an approach. So very successful project. And we learned that you can do efficiency while respecting historic fabric, and that, frankly, mechanical system and ductwork, as evidenced by, Pierce only being 17 and Lyman being 47. I think that has a lot to do with our gains, those mechanical system changes. And then just, our anecdote is just insulation contractors that were not interested in working with us that much. It took us a long time to find someone that would kind of go along with what we wanted to do, because they just want to go in, spray foam, move on. So that was a little bit difficult. One of the last points I have is just behaviors and traditional techniques. I think what we don't want to lose sight of as we think about upgrades to our buildings is that people have been struggling with this for a long time, and there's a lot of tools and techniques that have developed over centuries for dealing with temperature, rain, all of these systems. Now, here we're looking at two different early kind of insulation models, whether it's the brick nogging on the left, or even we have found eelgrass insulation bats in our buildings. From when, we're not entirely sure. But usually we have seen some commercially packaged stuff from the early 20th century, but also not commercially packaged eelgrass in our buildings. So people have been playing with this stuff, including just, deep porches, awnings, playing with your shutters, playing with your windows. What time of day do you open which window? A lot of these things were all designed to make these houses flow and get airflow and cool the houses without modern interventions. Likewise, even just the positioning of the house is really important, and how the sun interacts with it in summer versus winter, and having trees at the right location to block the sun in summer but allow the light in winter. All of this is very important, and all of this came to a full head this year with COVID as we tried to open our house museums. But our systems are not designed for maximum air flow. Most of our houses don't even have systems. But the minute you open that front door and the back door especially a central hall house, that building vents immediately, and you get a breeze. This day we're at the Langdon House in Portsmouth. We opened both doors. It was a day with not much breeze, but the minute we did that, this chandelier was humming because the breeze was so significant. So if you think about how the buildings kind of were built and designed originally, that really provides us with some tools for the future. And maybe we don't need to be relying on electric for certain things, or air conditioning, if we're actually thoughtful about how our houses were used and originally kind of situated, or all of these different factors play a hand. I think about Cape houses. I go to the Cape all the time. I think about Cape houses and the new houses having these giant windows that don't open, and I don't understand the logic of that, because you need those windows to open for the breeze. Why aren't you opening your windows? And I struggle with that quite a bit. And my final note, this is it, I'm going to stop here, is just, we are at the early stages of renewable energy exploration. I would say, 15 years ago, we kind of looked at it half-heartedly, and it was complicated, and a lot has changed since then for everything. But I think it was maybe the first speaker, and Mary was making comments about, how Nantucket harvested fuel in one way, like the whaling industry, and now maybe can harvest fuel in another way, which leads to the solar conversation this afternoon. And isn't that appropriate? And it made me really think. I was thinking overnight about this, and how many of our sites were independent. I show the historic wind turbine at the Eustis Estate. Well, they generated their own illuminating gas in the 19th century. Then they generated their own electricity in the 20th century. And I don't think it was until like, 1940 that they hooked up into the power grid. And that's a powerful thought for me to think about, perpetuating kind of this self-reliance of these estates, and can we make them self-reliant again? And so with that, I am going to end, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really exciting. There's a lot of work going on at Historic New England, and thank you for bringing us up to speed on so much of it. Yeah, I was really taken with the idea of thinking about how the buildings were designed originally and using those original uses. And so we have a comment in the chat from another Mary that she says, I was able to not install my window air conditioners this year by managing my window openings and shades and using a fan in whichever room I was in. And I know she's out here on Nantucket, where we are blessed with some lovely sea breezes, and we do look at the temperatures on the mainland in the summer and think of all of you. But it's true. I agree with you about the large windows. So Mary also asked another question in the chat, which was, how was water managed by the original builders or occupants of the property?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a complex answer, but I would say that many of the traditions we have handed down are trial and error over centuries, right? So at a certain point, why is an estate house up on a terrace? Well, it's prominent, it's big, it conveys importance, but it also sheds water. And I think a lot of things, whether it was in your face or not in your face, they played a lot with kind of elevation and moving water away from a building. Not all houses had gutters or needed gutters because the ground was shedding the water. And so if you have a nice slope away from your ground, what we find is over 200 years, plantings, grass, soil, leaves, everything builds up, and all of a sudden, the ground is much higher than it used to be. And so a lot of our big drainage projects are kind of reestablishing grades that maybe haven't even existed, in 100 or 200 years, to get back to actually what the original designers had intended: keep the sill up out of the dirt and move the water away. And so we kind of favor reestablishing those, in part because it's the tried and true way, but also because it works. Well, it is the tried and true way. It works.
I think that's a good point to remember, that when looking at a historic property or site, the way we're looking at it is not necessarily the way that it looked when it was first built or 200 years ago, even down to the grading. We see this with our streets in town, where everybody thinks that the cobblestone streets and this undulation of the streets, and cobblestone is a material that water can seep through in the sand. It's not necessarily, it would have been this graded surface when it was first put down. And how do things change? And we see that in houses around here where they really sink into the sand.
Right.
And there's a lot to dig out. I had if anybody else has questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat. I had a question. You talked about, I thought that was really a dramatic example and great to see, of the insulation and where the frame of the house was and where the mold mildew was. And you talked a bit about plaster and repairing plaster. How have you seen historic building materials like plaster hold up to these weather events?
Well, we had a sad but massive water leak. So it's not from a rain event, but I'm going to say, if we're talking about plaster, I'm specifically going to use this as an example, because we had a fourth floor toilet in one of our facilities. Fixture broke, water cascaded down for about 10 hours before anyone discovered it. I am going to tell you that this was in an office location, as a historic building, but there was drop ceilings, all of that stuff had to be thrown out. Everything new had to be thrown out. where it hit the historic plaster, the plaster did what it's supposed to do. It dries. It has drying potential, which a lot of materials, modern materials, don't have. So in that case, you know, plaster is an amazing product that is resilient. And so, you know, that's, you know, that example. I think on the exterior, it is very much like what they were talking about in the deconstruction conversation, which is it's really hard to procure good materials these days. The old growth wood is so far superior that it does degrade rapidly, and so you are forced to kind of make certain decisions. Or can you get, you know, X? Can we get this material for that? What's it going to cost? You know, obviously everything has a cost, and how do we play it all? But the you know, again, the older materials stay, they last. You know, the good for the environment, the lead paint, but like lead paint would last for like 100 years on a building, unlike, you know, latex right now. And latex, you know, blows off in 5 years and you're repainting. And what does that cost? So right now we're actually playing a lot with going back to linseed oil based paints, and a more traditional material. Instead of lead, it's zinc, which has some of the kind of properties you want from the lead. But, you know, I think more and more, it's almost as if traditional materials are actually the way. And I think if I use a linseed oil paint, it's going to be harder to do, but it's going to last a lot longer than a latex paint job. And there's no VOCs, there's no, you know, there's no, it's the same, it's like all natural. It's like 100% natural. And what, you know, that's an amazing, again, amazing thought. You know, like, should we be moving back more towards traditional because that's actually the most organic and green thing we could do.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of a interior flooding event at my grandparents' house that had plaster, and how that dried out, you know, and you were able to move on. And
yeah,
we see a lot, you know, on Nantucket, and I'm sure in other historic places where we've got so much, you know, we have a lot of restrictions on what you can do to the exterior of the building, but not what you can do to the interior. So there's a lot of, you know, 200-year-old plaster walls that are getting ripped out and got rehabs. And it's interesting to think that is, you know, it's not just a bad choice because you're removing the historic fabric and, you know, disrupting the structure, but it could be beneficial to you to keep those plaster walls in the long run as we think about, you know, dealing with flooding events. So, right. Yeah, well, I think that was really exceptional, and you know, you're doing such a fabulous job over there. And we look forward to coming to visit some properties. Let's see, we've got, oh, here, okay, Anne has a question. Do you have any advice regarding insulating plaster or re-insulating?
For re-insulating.
And do you mean, I think she means regarding
insulating plaster. If that is a product, yeah, if that is a product, so if insulating plaster is a product, I'm going to apologize, I'm not familiar with it, so I don't think I could comment on it. I think overall the insulation is a tricky thing because of the dynamics of moisture and how it moves. And to the conversation we were just having, plaster dries out because we don't have something behind it blocking it from the drying potential. So there is a little trade-off there in that you get good performance from the material, but maybe it's not quite as warm and toasty in the wintertime because you don't have the same. But if there's a product called insulating plaster, I apologize, I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, yeah, I see what Ann is saying. Well, sorry, let me just look at these. Plaster breathes. Yeah. If you do that, she's saying if you insulate plaster, you lose that breathing. Yeah, I guess put on another sweater, as my mother would say.
Right.
But certainly, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about what you could do in a house museum versus a house that has to be occupied year round. So,
well, that was our big challenge, was that our collections team didn't want us. Well, technically, let's just say in a normal time, the collections team doesn't want to open the doors or the windows because they want to control the environment as much as possible. But a lot of our houses don't have good systems, and so we have high relative humidity in those spaces. So so they were totally on board this year. We're doing a big experiment with opening the windows and doors to see what's happening to the environment. Are we getting better changes, and to kind of pay attention to kind of the dynamics of that cause and effect to the collections. But in the meantime, everyone feels a lot more safe and comfortable in the houses because they can feel the breeze, they can feel the fresh air instead of walking in what typically is like a kind of a closed, stuffy environment. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of figure out that maybe this is good, or maybe there are certain houses that this is totally fine. We should keep the doors open and not invest in air conditioning or, you know, some other system. You know, let's keep the traditional alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't thought, you know, it's interesting to think about. So often when we're talking about historic preservation as it relates to homes, you know, we're saying in discussions with homeowners, you know, we understand you don't want to live in a museum. Nobody wants to live in a museum, but the idea of making a museum more like a house and to follow those traditional use practices. Interesting. Bill writes, linseed oil and zinc for an exterior finish sounds like a good alternative to latex paint. I think milk paint finishes are also a good example of traditional material that has multiple advantages for interior finishes, especially on plaster walls.
And lime wash also. So, you know, again, there's something to be said about traditional paints. Now, finding a contractor who will put it on for you. I did. So again, I referenced the Cape Cod, and my in-laws have a place in Chatham. And this summer I spent a week doing linseed oil paint on their boathouse. And so I'll see how it goes.
That sounds great. That sounds like a great workshop that people would love to attend.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for your presentation. And folks, we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back at 10:15 and start talking about solar. So I hope you'll be able to join us. And if not, again, all this will be emailed out. So we look forward to seeing some of you later. Bye, everyone.